Hello, I'm Jesse Camacho. This is number 0791, the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder, and it comes to you right now.
The following program is brought to you in living color.
Now, it's time for an eclectic mix of interviews and some of the oddest news stories you'll ever hear. It's the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder.
Hey there, hi there, ho there! Peter Anthony Holder here with you, and yes, this is indeed another edition of the Stuff File program, number 0791. And coming up on this edition of the Stuff File program, you'll meet Anna Rosner, who is the author of the historical book for young readers called Eyes on the Ice, which deals with two hockey-playing brothers who live in Czechoslovakia in 1963. Previously, she wrote two hockey biographies for young readers, but this new one is a fictionalized story of a dark time in history. How did her previous two hockey biographies prepare her for this book?
I think that I needed to write those biographies in order to better understand how to write for young readers, because Eyes on the Ice is a middle grade novel for ages 9 to 12, and I learned how to respect the child's voice through those two biographies. And I was very lucky in that the editor of those two books, her name is Katarina de Backer. She was really wonderful, and I learned a lot from her about speaking to a child through literature.
Bernie Finkelstein has produced a documentary called Atomic Reaction, which touches on Canada's role in the creation of the atomic bomb. It's a documentary that initially started focusing on the uranium cleanup of Port Hope, Ontario.
The deeper we looked at the cleanup going on in Port Hope, the more intrigued and more interesting the story and the history of uranium in Canada, its use in the Manhattan Project, and its aftermath became. But prior to making this film, I didn't really have any knowledge about this subject, as most Canadians don't, which is what I'm hoping our film will do, is to tell Canadians about their role.
Marc Hartzman, the curator of WeirdHistorian.com, shares the weird story for the month of October about the works Mark Twain continued to write after he was dead.
Twain was writing books in the afterlife through a Ouija board, through different mediums. One of his books was called Jap Heron, which came out in 1917, so 7 years after he had died. It didn't do well, by the way. It wasn't as popular as his works from when he was alive. From the New York Times from September 9th, 1917, it said, if this is the best that Mark Twain can do by reaching across the barrier, the army of admirers that his works have won for him will all hope that he will hereafter respect that boundary.
And there's lots and lots of Stuff File news and, of course, an idiot of the day. The guest slater, the person who told you this was show number 0791, was Jesse Camacho, who you may have seen in such shows as Lock and Key and also Fubar, both on Netflix. He also had a 5-year run on the TV series Less Than Kind, and he's also the lead voice of Binky on the animated series Agent Binky, Pets of the Universe. I happened to see Jesse on stage when he was just a teenager, and he was a great actor then, so congratulations on all you've been doing. And thank you very much for doing the guest slate on this edition of the Stuff File program, a show that is listener-supported, fan-funded radio that depends on you for our success. Join us at patreon.com to help make this show an even bigger and better radio experience. Well, let's get right to the stuff. Here's a story that can be chalked up to a series of mistakes. On October the 6th, 36-year-old Clewan Williams of Toledo, Ohio, was teaching his 9-year-old son how to back up the car. First mistake. With another child in the back seat. Second mistake. Williams was standing outside the car with the driver's door open and told the boy to hit the brake. When the child pressed the wrong pedal, Williams, who was intoxicated, third mistake, was struck and dragged under the car. He was taken to hospital and is expected to face charges of wrongful entrustment of a motor vehicle and endangering children. By the way, I know how these things can go horribly wrong, but when they go right, they can be a thing of beauty and a lifelong memory. I myself once drove a city bus at the age of 10, and I have the pictures to prove it. I only went about 10 feet, just rolling, no gas pedal. I think that the statute of limitations have finally run out. But this guy from Toledo, he will always have the scars to prove his inebriated decision-making process. And by the way, I will post a picture of me driving a bus on the Stuff File program social media. Indonesian police have arrested a man near Jakarta identified as Ra after he allegedly sold his 11-month-old baby on Facebook for $995 to fund his gambling addiction. When the baby's mother returned home, she asked him where the child was. According to police, Ra saw on Facebook that the buyers were looking to purchase a toddler, so he sent them a message and arranged the purchase. Police found the child in a rented home and arrested 2 adults suspected of human trafficking. And here I thought that compulsive gamblers loved and doted on their children. I mean, how often do you notice when a gambler rolls the dice? They often shout, "Baby needs a new pair of shoes."
It's like laying dice. A guy says, "Baby needs a new pair of shoes." That doesn't mean she needs them. It's just a disfigurement of speech.
Oh, really? My bad. We have a couple of stories here that deal with people's peccadillos. First up, 28-year-old Jesse Johnson was arrested on September 24th in Gilbert, Arizona, after 3 instances in which he allegedly spied on women's feet as they vacuumed their cars. Police said Johnson's M.O. at the Superstar Car Wash in Gilbert was to park next to a woman's car at the vacuum station, then slide underneath her car for a few minutes before climbing back out. One victim said she felt very violated and "I've been having nightmares." It's not the first time Johnson has been caught lusting after feet. Court documents reveal that he had been cited at least 4 times in Nebraska and that he had touched a woman's ankle at a grocery store. He admitted to authorities there that he is sexually attracted to women's feet and at times can't control his sexual desires. Johnson was charged with 3 counts of voyeurism and 3 counts of disorderly conduct and held on $10,000 bond.
You have gorgeous feet.
Thank you.
I don't suppose you'd let me rub them? Nothing weird, just a foot massage.
I would let a homeless schizophrenic rub my feet.
I'll get my oils.
Yeah, even in a movie, that's not normal. And the second story in people's peccadillos. For the past 6 years, someone wearing a mask and latex gloves brings bottles of labeled urine to a Pasadena, California street, artfully arranges them on a utility box, then takes off. Nobody knows their identity. Locals call him the Piss Bandit or Pee Bandit, thanks to the pop bottles, juice cartons, and gallon jugs filled with pee. On the containers of yellow liquid are often drawings of smiley faces or messages that read human urine or HIV positive. The Pee Bandit strikes several times a week, bringing bottles that appear in the mornings but vanish by nightfall. Grant Yansura, who launched an investigation into the culprit with his partner, filmmaker Derek Milton, said, "It's been a tug-of-war between the neighborhood and this guy." He went on to say,
all different colors, shades of, from like an amber hue to like more of a healthy golden, lighter yellow, but some are really dark and concerning.
Well, the secret secretor might want to check with his urologist. Yeah. After 6 years, some people are beginning to think that this is some sort of weird art installation.
We think he's an artist, because I never really understand art or really get art. And when we couldn't figure out what was going on and I couldn't get it, that's when we realized maybe it's art.
Maybe the peeing Picasso is into stream of consciousness art. Whatever the case, when they finally catch him, you know what the authorities are going to say. You're in trouble. Anyway, let's get to our first guest here on this edition of the Stuff File program, shall we? Anna Rosner is the author of Eyes on the Ice. It's the tale of two hockey-loving brothers who live in Czechoslovakia in 1963. Anna is also a teacher who has written two hockey biographies for young readers. She joins us via Zoom from Toronto. Hi, Anna.
Hi.
Thanks for being on the program with us. Now, I'm just curious, is it the idea for you to share history with young people through hockey?
That's a good question. I think hockey is a great lens to make historical fiction more accessible to young people. So I would say yes, I definitely wanted to write about communist Czechoslovakia, and I knew that I had to modernize the story in some way or another. So I chose to use the hockey lens because it was something I knew how to write about.
You say you knew how to write about it. You have written before a couple of hockey biographies for young readers. Those are biographies, though. This, as you say, is fiction. So what's the difference in writing the previous books that you've written and now what you've written with Eyes on the Ice?
I think that I needed to write those biographies in order to better understand how to write for young readers, because Eyes on the Ice is a middle grade novel for ages 9 to 12. And I learned how to respect the child's voice through those two biographies. And I was very lucky in that the editor of those two books, her name is Katerina de Backer. She was really wonderful, and I learned a lot from her about speaking to a child through literature. Writing fiction was not that new for me. I've been writing fiction for a long time, and I've actually published short stories for adults, and I've been writing poetry for forever, just for myself, really, but maybe one day it will be in print. But yeah, I feel like I needed the biographies in order to make that step into the fictional realm on a kind of larger scale, because a short story, I think, is a little bit easier than a novel, even if it is for young readers.
Now, back in 1963, Czechoslovakia was under a really brutal communist regime. What made you decide to write about this particular story and also to bring it in through the lens of two hockey-playing boys?
For one, I see a lot of parallels between society, maybe in the United States, and some of these communist regimes that date, from the 50s and 60s. We tend to think of these eras as really far away, but in fact, communism was dissolved in 1989. It's very recent history. And I think it's important that young children be familiar with these eras in the sense that the media was controlled at the time. Education was controlled. Propaganda, was of course controlled, and the courts of law were controlled as well. And I see that in today's world, very tragically. But I see that, I guess, when, the Supreme Court is sort of organized according to Trump's wishes, and not to get too much into politics, but, that's a kind of decision to try and determine the trajectory of the judicial branch in a way. So I see those things as very dangerous today. And I guess I wanted to return to history to say this is not new, some of the things that we're seeing. But the reason I chose communist Czechoslovakia was because my son, who was 7 at the time, he was talking about freedom, I believe, at school. And I explained that, in some countries you couldn't read the books that you like and you couldn't celebrate your religion freely. And he was 7, and I wasn't quite sure what he had understood, but I told him about the Prague Spring, which was a very brief period of liberalization in 1968. Didn't last long, about 7 months. And he drew a picture of it with books and people in jail and also Soviet tanks that came in to put an end to that sort of joyous period for the Czech people. And I realized that a child could understand these things if they were simplified.
So tell us about the story and the two boys in Eyes on the Ice.
So Lucas and Dennis are living in a very tight-knit family. They have a younger brother. Their sister is also born, and she's an infant throughout the story. And the father prints papers for a newspaper and is seemingly apolitical, but in fact he is involved in an underground organization which opposes the communist regime. And eventually, well, the boys discover hockey and they, fall in love with it. And they're both extremely talented players and very tall, which is what attracts a coach to them. And he eventually invites them to come play at the local hockey rink. And during that time, the father is involved in these clandestine activities. And he is arrested. And, there's no information. People sort of just disappeared, particularly under Stalin, which was a little earlier than this book in the 1950s. But dissidents just disappeared, and no one ever knew where they were or whether they were alive or if they were in prison camps. And eventually they're approached by an oko, which is, or ochko, I guess, which is a Czech word for a secret agent. And he offers them information on their father if they agree to throw a hockey game between the visiting Soviet team and their own teams at a tournament. They have to make that decision and a lot of sacrifices in order to save their father.
That's a pretty heady situation for a 10-year-old to be in.
Yes, it definitely is. It is. But I think sometimes young people do have to make these heart-wrenching decisions. And sadly, they have to face decisions that shouldn't be made until you're an adult. But it happens a lot.
When writing the book, I mean, as you say, you explain to your own son a situation that was in history. When you're sitting down and you're writing this, do you have to really get into your child eye's mind to write a story like this?
You do. And at first, I didn't write the book the right way. This book actually sat in a drawer for 5 years. And the reason for that is that I sent an original version to an editor, and he was very kind in that he wrote back to me, which is unusual when it comes to submitting manuscripts. Usually you get a form letter that says, no, we don't want it. But he actually took the time to write back and said, this is promising, but you're way too focused on the politics of the era. And I was. And I also had the protagonist grow up to be, 18 and 20, I believe. And I had this, sort of high-speed chased affection at the end of the book. And, when you're 18, you're no longer speaking as a child. And I realized that the protagonist could not grow up, that he had to stay 10 during the story, and that was what would speak to a young reader, as opposed to an 18-year-old voice. So I was very lucky that someone was able to sort of teach me how to tackle this kind of a story.
Well, congratulations on the success of the book. Before I let you go, though, there's another point that I want to bring up, and the fact is that you are also the director of Books with Wings, which provides new quality picture books for Indigenous children living in isolated communities. How did that start for you?
That started, I guess, 12 years ago or more. I think 14 now. And I was volunteering for a different non-for-profit, and I was helping them write grants, because after being in graduate school for so long, you figure out how to do it. And I was able to research a lot of the conditions on First Nations reserves. And when I was in contact with the principals, I learned that 99% of children on isolated reserves don't own a single book. That to me was quite shocking, because I had my own child who was very young at the time, and I could see what he was learning through books and how much they meant to him and the way his language was developing, thanks to these books. So I started this project, which was very small at first. In fact, my mother and my mother-in-law made the very first donations. And I eventually, got volunteers, and that grew. And to date, we've sent about over 23,000 brand new books to children who would otherwise have none. So it's a very heartwarming project, because we also write them letters, and I receive these wonderful, colorful letters with stickers in my mailbox, every few weeks with new book requests, and we send books back to them just to make sure that the children are getting books they love. So it's a very rewarding project.
That's fantastic. I'm sure there are listeners out there right now who are thinking, wow, this seems to be a great idea. How can we help, if at all? So is there a website, or is there a situation where people can donate or whatever?
Yes. Yeah, We have a website. It's books-with-wings.org. That's because the bookswithwings.com was taken somewhere. But you can find us if you look for First Nations Literacy Project and Books with Wings. We'll come right up. And we're also on Facebook and Instagram. And we are supported entirely by the community because 100% of all donations go to the children. The purchase of books, and that's all. Maybe, a few stickers. But so anyone who wants to donate, can do it by contacting us through Facebook or through my website. Just send me an email. We provide receipts, etc. if anyone needs those. Sometimes we're supported by corporations. Yeah, we're extremely grateful to still be functioning after all these years, even though we're small. We're small but mighty.
Well, congratulations on the amazing work you do with Books with Wings, and also congratulations on Eyes on the Ice, your latest book. And I'm just curious to know, now that you have this one out, are you going to follow up with other historical information that revolves around, say, sports in other stories?
Not at this time. I mean, I've sort of made a decision. I guess it probably won't hold, but I made a decision to not write about hockey. And I have switched to a graphic text, which is actually a nonfiction graphic text, which takes place in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is about as far away from hockey as one can get. And I've integrated into the story my own cousin, who was a prisoner himself in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it's about music and the importance of music under those devastating conditions. So still a historical text and still for children, but not a hockey puck in sight.
And when is that one coming out?
It's still in process. It's still being looked at by editors, and we'll see what happens. It's all very new, but my fingers are crossed.
Well, when it does come out, will you come back on the show and talk to us about it?
I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, yeah. Anna, thank you very, very much for being on the program with us.
Thanks for having me. It was great. Thank you.
Anna Rosner, author of Eyes on the Ice. You can go to our website at thestufffile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0791, and you'll find links to Anna's site, plus links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order her book directly. You'll also find the link to Anna's other site for Books with Wings. You're listening to the Stuff File program with me, Peter Anthony Holder.
There's still more guests, more news, and an idiot of the day coming your way on the Stuff File program. Stay tuned. The Stuff File program is a listener-supported, fan-funded radio show that depends on you for our success. Join us at patreon.com to help make this show an even bigger and better radio experience. Sign up and find out about our rewards program. Being a patron doesn't have to be a long-term commitment. There's absolutely no obligation. You could join today and end whenever you'd like. But the time we have your support would be so greatly appreciated. We'd also love to hear your thoughts about the show and even your ideas for rewards. Join us for the ride. Join us at patreon.com/thestufffile program.
It's 12 time. Ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah.
Available on Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and just about every other way you stream audio. This is the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder. It's radio that's everywhere you want to be, and some places you don't.
And still to come in the program, we'll talk to the filmmaker who made the documentary Atomic Reaction. Plus, Marc Hartzman shares a weird story for the month of October. We also have an idiot of the day coming your way a little later on, and much more in Stuff File News right here, right now. In late September, Derek Johnson, owner of JVI Secret Gardens in Donaldson, Tennessee, was alerted by an employee that someone was walking around the garden center wearing a clown mask. But Johnson was not about to physically confront the creepy clown, whom he could see on surveillance video. Johnson clicked on his security system's speaker, but before he could say anything, the clown backed off, saying, "I'm leaving." He left behind a propane tank and saw blade that he had picked up to steal. Said Johnson incredulously, "This is a sweet little garden center." Police are investigating. So, Outside of the video, the cops have no leads. I wonder what they're saying now.
But where are the clouds?
A man who was aboard a small plane that made an emergency landing in Oceanside, California, has been charged with possession of cocaine with intent to distribute. 36-year-old Troy Othniel Smith of Oceanside is accused of trying to hide a drug package from police shortly after the plane in which he was riding landed on State Route 76 in the early morning hours of September 26th. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office, the plane took off from San Diego on September 25th, flew to Mesa, Arizona, and was headed back to California the next day. Mechanical issues forced the emergency landing on SR 76 near Canyon Drive. Sometime after Smith and the pilot departed the plane and spoke with responding Oceanside police officers, Smith allegedly unzipped a backpack he was wearing, drawing the attention of an officer. According to authorities, he then tossed a package into the bushes near a guardrail on the highway. The contents of the package tested positive for cocaine, and Smith was arrested. Smith already was the target of an investigation by the DEA and U.S. Postal Service for allegedly shipping drugs in the mail from Oceanside to various U.S. locations. Well, I guess he went from being a drug mule to a drug ass. And finally, in this section of Stuff File News, before we get to our next guest here in this edition of the Stuff File program with me, Peter Anthony Holder, sheriff's deputies in Washington's Kitsap County frequently get calls about animals, loose livestock, problem dogs. But the 911 call they received recently from a woman being hounded by dozens of raccoons swarming her home in a suburb of Seattle stood out. The woman reported having had to flee her property after 50 to 100 raccoons descended upon it and were acting aggressively. She told deputies she started feeding a family of raccoons decades ago, and it was fine until about 6 weeks ago when the number showing up went from a handful to about 100. She said those raccoons were becoming increasingly more aggressive, demanding food, that they would hound her day and night, scratching on the outside of her home at the door. If she pulled up in her car, they would surround the car, scratch at the car, and surround her if she went from the front door to her car or went outside at all. Said Kevin McCarty, a spokesperson for the sheriff's office, they saw this as a food source now, so they kept coming back to it and they kept expecting food. It was not clear what caused their numbers to balloon suddenly. Both the sheriff's office and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife determined no laws were broken. Said McCarty, this is a nuisance problem, kind of her own making, that she has to deal with. Video from the sheriff's office shows raccoons milling around trees, and deputies who responded to the call observed 50 to 100 of them. Bridget Meyer, a spokesperson with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, said that under state law it is illegal to feed large carnivores, such as bears or cougars. While municipalities or counties may have local statutes forbidding the feeding of other wildlife, it is not against state law. Regardless, the agency discourages people from feeding wildlife. Raccoons, for example, can carry diseases, and food can also attract predators such as coyotes and bears. Myers said an agency wildlife conflict specialist has met with the woman who has stopped feeding the critters. Said Meyer, the raccoons appear to have started dispersing now that they are no longer being fed, and we are glad for a positive outcome in the case. Well, she did bring this on herself, however. And I don't know about the raccoons. Maybe the raccoons are just regrouping, like a bad horror sequel.
But don't feed the raccoons. Killer Raccoons 2. Dark Christmas in the Dark.
And let's get to our next guest here in this edition of the Stuff File program. The record-breaking success of Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer shined a fresh light on the development of the A-bomb and the result of using it. But what was Canada's role in the deadly device? Well, the new feature-length documentary, Atomic Reaction, reveals the pivotal role Canada played in making nuclear warfare a reality. The movie is produced by Bernie Finkelstein, and he joins us via Zoom from Toronto. Hi, Bernie.
Hi, how you doing?
Just tickety-boo. Thanks very much for being on the program with us. So what led you to being interested in learning and sharing the building of the A-bomb and Canada's role in it?
Well, the short story is I spent almost all of my career, well, my whole of my career in the music business. And I did produce 2 music documentaries. And I got approached by a filmmaker in Prince Edward County, where I live here in Ontario. He asked me if we could do a music doc together. And I said, well, I'd love to do another documentary, but I was looking for something more challenging. Not that music is not challenging, but I wanted to get my learning curve. I wanted to get something steeper. So he asked me, are you aware of the cleanup in Port Hope? I said, a little bit. So we started looking at that. And the deeper we looked at the cleanup going on in Port Hope, the more intrigued and more interesting the story and the history of uranium in Canada, its use in the Manhattan Project, and its aftermath became. And we got lucky and got a license from CBC Doc Channel, and we were able to put together the financing. And of course, it's a fascinating topic. But prior to making this film, other than, a kind of mild interest in nuclear, as all of us do, one way or the other, I didn't really have any knowledge about this subject, as most Canadians don't, which is what I'm hoping our film will do, is to tell Canadians about their role.
So again, you were looking, I guess, initially at the cleanup of Port Hope.
Yes.
At what point during the research part of all of this did the shift change to not only the cleanup, but also some of the history of uranium in this country?
Well, of course, the cleanup was caused by the fact that Port Hope is the home to a uranium processing plant. It was built in 1932 by Gilbert Labine, the person who discovered the uranium at Great Bear Lake. As we started looking at the plant, we started looking at the history of the plant, and it all unfolded in front of our eyes. That the uranium was discovered in 1930 at Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories, the world's 8th largest lake, by the way, a beautiful lake. It was discovered on Dene territory. It was then shipped over 6,000 kilometers from Great Bear Lake to Port Hope, down the Mackenzie River. Anyway, a fascinating story. What happened was they started processing the pitch blende, is what it's called, and they started getting uranium, which was worth $75,000 an ounce, give or take, for a while during that period, again in the early 30s. There was a lot of waste, and it's difficult to know whether they knew that this waste was dangerous or whether they didn't know it, because it's a long time ago, and there's not a lot on record that we could find as to attitudes. But they put it all around Port Hope, in ravines, in the bay. It's all over the place. And in the 60s, they started getting worried about it, and it took years and years, as these things do. And they started a cleanup, and you'll have to forgive me, I believe the cleanup started around 10 years ago, and it was supposed to be $1.2 billion to clean it up, which was already a high amount. But now they're, I think, into their second 10 years, and we don't really know the exact price, but it's well over $3 billion now.
When they first found uranium and they were bringing it down, as you say, to Port Hope, it wasn't really known, even though the price was very, very high of it, it wasn't really known what it could be used for. What was the ramp up during the World War II that led this project to be even more important and more valuable than it was probably going in?
Yes, in and around 1938, the Germans, the Nazis, who were running Germany at that time, invented fission. In other words, they figured out how to split the atom. And so many of the physicists living in the US were refugees, really, from Germany. Many of them Jewish, but many of them not. And many of them Americans, some Canadians, by the way. And everybody at that period, I'm talking around 1937, 38, they dreaded the idea of the Nazis and Hitler coming up with an atomic bomb, although nobody knew exactly what kind of bomb they could build. So they went to see Roosevelt in 38. They got Einstein involved peripherally. Einstein signed a letter. Roosevelt and his inner cabinet read the letter saying that Hitler had a good chance to make a terrible, terrible weapon. But the American government was not really on a war footing, and they put the letter in a drawer, and it took until Pearl Harbor. Apparently, one of the first things that Franklin D. Roosevelt did after Pearl Harbor was to pull out that letter, and he brought in General Grove, who ran the project with Oppenheimer, and they started what was called the Manhattan Project. And it was the Manhattan Project that made the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also the test bomb called Trinity. All of that uranium was processed in Port Hope. And so that's what made it so pertinent and so important. And it was very, very important to the American government. And the Canadian government was involved along with the British on this. And in fact, the Canadian government took the privately owned mine, which we got to know as Port Radium, where it was discovered. It wasn't called Port Radium when they discovered it, but a whole town got built up around the mine at Great Bear Lake. And the uranium was sent on this incredible journey down the Mackenzie River and to the railhead, and then by rail to Port Hope, and there it was processed.
Okay, so your film touches on this story, and your film also talks about the cleanup that is, well, for lack of a better term, ongoing. And
yes, it is. Yeah.
So basically speaking, when you look at the two bookends of this story, what is it that you want your audience who watches this film, what do you want them to take away from this movie?
Well, first and foremost, we wanted to give them the actual history, because we believe that most Canadians, the ones I speak to, before we made the film and while we were making the film, didn't really know anything about this. They really knew nothing. I mean, now I can't speak for every Canadian. I'm sure there's Canadian historians that are quite aware of all of this. But I would say the average Canadian has no idea that the uranium in the bombs dropped on Japan was processed in Port Hope, and that some of it was probably right from Great Bear Lake. But all of it was processed. So the first thing, we're just telling the story. We want the viewer to come to their own conclusions about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, whether we don't take any position on nuclear power one way or the other. We just let people talk, and we bring in a lot of experts, and they talk about the situation, both historically and currently.
And what do you want? What
I really want is Canadians to understand their own history.
And what do you want the audience to take away from the cleanup or lack thereof?
Well, there's no question that there's a cleanup going. So I have no question about that. They're in there. They're doing the cleanup. You can see it going on now. Well, just that there is, obviously there is a danger to nuclear power and that, and as to how you make uranium and how you process it, and that one has to be very, very cautious about how one approaches it. And there wasn't a lot of caution shown at the beginning. However, I'm not necessarily here to blame Gilbert Labine, who is the man who discovered the uranium and also the man who processed it, because I'm not sure he understood it entirely himself. It's quite a baby industry still, but it's one that has its dangers, and our film is intended to show not so much here are the dangers, but to show people this is what happened, this is what's still happening, and hopefully it will help people be more considerate going forward. That's what I hope.
And how can people see the film Atomic Reaction?
Well, we have sold it to CBC, the CBC documentary channel. It will be shown at 9 p.m. on October 27th, and that's 9 p.m. Eastern Time. If you live in other parts of the country, you should check the time. And then it'll go to GEM, the CBC streaming service, in January, and then you'll be able to stream it at any time you want. We're also having a special screening at the Drift Festival, the Durham Regional International Film Festival, happening in Whitby and Ajax. That screening is on October 24th, and you could just sort of look up Drift, Google Drift, DRIFF. And then there's one other event in our hometown. It's not really my hometown, but at the town closest to where my farm is, in Picton, Ontario, on November 24th, Sunday afternoon matinee. We're doing a charity screening of the film.
Excellent. Bernie, thank you very, very much for taking the time to be on the program with us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the time.
Bernie Finkelstein, producer of the documentary film Atomic Reaction. As Bernie mentioned, you can see the documentary on the CBC later this month. You can also see it on the CBC streaming service GEM in January. Check your local listings. Bernie also mentioned that it will be at the Drift Film Festival later this month. You can go to our website at thestufffile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0791, and you'll find the link to the Drift Film Festival website, plus the film's Facebook page. You're listening to the Stuff File program with me, Peter Anthony Holden.
Got something for the mailbag? Drop Peter a line. He'd love to hear from you. Send your email to mailbag@thestuffile.com. And remember, stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's mailbag@thestuffile.com. Or catch up with him on Twitter or Facebook. There's more Stuff File coming your way in just a few moments.
Here's a brief word about our show and my book. If you become a regular Patreon patron of the Stuff File program, I'll give you an e-version of my book, Great Conversations, My Interviews with Two Men on the Moon and a Galaxy of Stars. It's easy to do. Just go to patreon.com and become a patron to help make this show an even bigger and better radio experience. So, join Patreon and claim your copy of Great Conversations, My Interviews with Two Men on the Moon and a Galaxy of Stars. Sign up at patreon.com/The Stuff File program.
This is the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder. Pay very close attention. There could be a test later.
And still to come on the program, Marc Hartzman from WeirdHistorian.com is back with the weird story for the month of October. Plus, we do indeed have an idiot of the day, but I've got more Stuff File news to share with you right here, right now. As if folks in Florida didn't have enough to worry about, State Fire Marshal Jimmy Patronis announced on October 9th that after Hurricane Helene came through in September, at least 48 fires involving lithium-ion batteries had been reported, 18 in electric vehicles and 1 electric wheelchair. Patronis went on to say,
the lithium-ion batteries, they have a caustic chain reaction when it comes to salt water, and it turns into what's called a thermal runaway. The car cannot be extinguished. If you're in a storm surge area and you don't heed the warnings that we've been issuing, you have cases where the house survives, but because of the salt water that entered into the house through flooding, the car ignites and then the house burns down.
Other products like electric scooters, golf carts, or children's toys could also be affected. Petronas went on to say that these compromised vehicles and devices are ticking time bombs. He suggested people move affected vehicles away from their homes. You know what else has a lithium-ion battery? Your cell phone. Be careful. Stay safe, Florida. 41-year-old Caroline Ashley of Liverpool, England, went all out on her Halloween decorations this year, installing fake tombstones and human skulls, but the pièce de résistance were the 2 body bags hanging upside down from a tree in front of her home. But the fun didn't last long. On September 24th, a Liverpool City Council worker stopped by to tell Ashley she would have to remove the body bags because a neighbor had complained. Said Ashley, "It was the quickest the council has come out for anything. I put them up, and he was round the following day." But she conceded a neighbor may have been triggered by the display. She said, "I don't want to offend anyone. That wasn't the intention." Ashley said she'll keep the body bags in her garage going forward. Well, that might be even creepier. Anyway, let's get to our last guest here in this edition of the Stuff File program, shall we? Marc Hartzman, the curator of WeirdHistorian.com, is back with a weird story for the month of October. He joins us via Skype from New York. And Marc, this time around we talk about Samuel Clemens, a.k.a. Mark Twain, or as I like to call him, the Talking Dead.
Yeah, and since it's October, Halloween month, we're talking about the ghost of Mark Twain, who was just as busy as the living Mark Twain. So Twain was writing books in the afterlife through a Ouija board, through different mediums. So one of his books was called Jap Heron, which came out in 1917, so 7 years after he had died. And he wrote this whole book. I have a copy of it, actually. It's pretty amazing. It was written through a Ouija board. And first of all, this book, it didn't do well, by the way. I should say that. It wasn't as popular as his works from when he was alive. In fact, I wrote about this in Chasing Ghosts, and I gave a few of the quotes I got from reviewers in the press. I'm just going to read one of them really quick from the New York Times from September 9th, 1917. It said, "If this is the best that Mark Twain, in quotes, can do by reaching across the barrier, the army of admirers that his works have won for him will all hope that he will hereafter respect that boundary."
Well,
so his work was kind of panned in the afterlife.
That's kind of tough talk from somebody who knows that they can't be in any retribution upon them.
I suppose that's true. Well, I mean, who knows if the ghost could go haunt that person, I suppose.
That's true.
But this was, the medium was Emily Grant Hutchings, and she said that, this was all coming from the ghost of Mark Twain, and that the character, Jap Heron, was reminiscent of young Sam Clemens. So then 2 years later, in October 1919, a magazine called Azoth, which was an occult magazine, ran an interview with the ghost of Mark Twain. So again, he's writing books and he's doing interviews with the occult press. Didn't do an interview with the Times, but he did with Azoth. And this particular medium printed that interview he did. And I reprinted that in my book called The Talking Dead, which is available through Curious Publications. So I thought I would just share with you some of the questions and answers that came from the interview with the spirit of Mark Twain.
Okay, so share.
Okay. So first of all, he asked Mark, he said, "What do you think of the present state of the world?" And Mark Twain's ghost said, "From what I can learn, I must confess that I am very glad not to be in the world at the present time, because it seems that the relative positions of souls are such that the great are mostly on the lower tier, while the less desirable invariably manage to get on top of the pile. As things are, men are retarding their ascent to a higher realm by their mental working, which is so deadly in its material outlook that only a cataclysm could ever awaken them to anything else. Money and power are still the great prizes for which all humanity seems to be struggling, and when the struggle is over, how poor even the wealthiest appear on this side of the river."
And this was in October of 1919?
Correct.
So I'm guessing if Mark Twain were able to get funds of any kind, he wouldn't have been betting on the Chicago White Sox that year.
No, I mean, he may have had some hints of who to bet on.
Well, it all depends on what he knew about the Chicago White Sox.
Well, that wasn't part of the interview, unfortunately.
Okay.
So we don't know, but it could be something that we could have a medium reach out to him again and see what he knows about this year's playoffs. So
well,
who knows?
It's an interesting point because as you're talking about 1919, has anyone talked to Mark Twain since then, or has he ceased communication?
Well, it's a good question, and I haven't seen any recent publications of interviews with Mark Twain. It seems like he kind of maybe he finally faded off into the other side. Enjoyed some time beyond the veil and stopped meddling in our earthly affairs.
So, what do you really think, Mark? Do you think this is true, or do you think someone's been pulling our legs?
I think it's possible that someone might be conjuring up thoughts about Mark Twain in various ways through books and interviews. But it is kind of fun to read what they're saying and how they're trying to make it sound as if it might be Mark Twain. And then they're trying to get information. And this is something Mark Twain by no means was the only one giving interviews through mediums. And this book, The Talking Dead, covers a bunch of different messages from the dead. That's why the title is there. It's all messages from beyond the veil, including various other celebrities. We're just talking about Mark Twain for the October interview of 1919. But no one ever gives like a good account of what the other side is really like. Everything is always really vague. And he tries to get that out of Mark Twain. And of course, he doesn't really get that. And also just like, how do we prove it? And again, no ghost can really offer it. And so he actually asks, he says, I wish you would say what could be done to prove the existence of the spirit world beyond all doubt so that skepticism would be ended. And Mark Twain says, men are getting a few glimpses of the spirit world by means of a few headstrong souls who insist upon returning to earth to announce that they are still alive. Some are hearing of the life beyond through their own intuitions, and some are getting help in other ways. But none are ever so thoroughly convinced that they are able to say with positive assurance, I know that life is continuing on another plane, and all my doubts have ended. There is still a lingering suspicion that they may have been deceived by the evidence.
Now, I'm just curious because you have this book out, which you published, which is The Talking Dead, and I'm curious to know, with all the other celebrities that are in it or other well-known people who are in it besides Mark Twain, has anybody reached out from the relatives or descendants of said dead person to either confirm or deny whether this is being spoken in the true form of that person who had been deceased?
Well, that's another good question. I will say that this isn't covered in The Talking Dead, but that happened with Houdini, because lots of mediums tried to speak to Houdini. Houdini famously said if anyone could speak from the other side, it would be him. And so he had given his wife, Bess, a code word, basically, that said, hey, if this comes through a medium, you'll know it was actually me, because no one else knows this word except for you and I, right? So various seances were held, and mediums said, oh, we have Houdini here, and this is what Houdini is saying, and here is all of his messages. And, of course, Bess would say, no, that wasn't Houdini. And she could confirm that it wasn't him. So I think that's a good example.
So obviously Houdini was a lot smarter than Mark Twain.
I mean, these were both very smart, amazing people.
Either that or he was a very lonely person that he couldn't confide in. I mean, this could be that.
That's true. Well, also, we don't want to, say that this was really Mark Twain, right? This could have been anybody. This could have been another spirit impersonating Mark Twain, for all we know.
Oh, now you're getting really
pranksters.
Now you're getting really meta.
Yeah, sure.
That's deep.
Well, we have celebrity impersonators in the living, and why not in the dead?
Interesting point. And on that note, I just want to, before we let you go, Curious Publications is your company as well. People can find out more information at curiouspublications.com. But tell us about The Talking Dead, the book overall.
Yeah, so the book, it covers just a whole bunch of examples I've pulled of mediums, and there's the conversations they had with the dead. So it just brings back, in some cases, just random spirits talking about different aspects of the afterlife. And then in some cases like this one, it's celebrities. I've got notes from George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Edgar Allan Poe, Benjamin Franklin, who has a whole list of aphorisms he wrote, like he did in life, but for the afterlife. And then there's a whole chapter about Mars and what life is like on Mars from a particular medium. and she gets into all kinds of details. So it just covers off on all these different aspects, again, of the other side and their messages. And these are all real messages that were printed in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Interesting indeed. Again, the book is The Talking Dead. Again, you are the historian or the curator of WeirdHistorian.com. And as always, it's a thrill to have you on the program, Marc.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Marc Hartzman, the curator of WeirdHistorian.com and also the publisher at CuriousPublications.com. He's the author of several books, his most recent one being We Are Not Alone, The Extraordinary History of UFOs and Aliens Invading Our Hopes, Fears, and Fantasies. You can go to our website at thestufffile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0791, and you'll find the link to Marc's site, plus links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order his books directly, including the aforementioned The Talking Dead. You're listening to the Stuff File program with me, Peter Anthony Holder. And boys and girls, it's the moment you've all been waiting for. It's time now for the Idiot of the Day.
And now it's time for the Strange Things Adults Do. The Stuff File presents the Idiot of the Day.
Cody Adams of Oklahoma was due for a court appearance in Pawnee County for a hearing on car theft charges on September the 27th. So when Adams couldn't bum a ride from any of the patrons at a gas station in Stillwater, some 30 minutes away, he improvised by commandeering an unoccupied LifeNet emergency services pickup and driving it to Pawnee. An Oklahoma Highway Patrol trooper caught Adams after he had ditched the pickup and was entering the courthouse. The trooper did make sure he made his court case. Adams was then transported to Payne County and booked on new charges. Now, why, oh why, if you have a court appearance for stealing a car, would you then steal another vehicle to get to said court date on time? One reason, and one reason only. You're an idiot!
Gee, I'm only a kid, but even I know you're an idiot.
And that's it for this edition of the Stuff File program, number 0791. Hope you enjoyed it. The website is thestufffile.com, and once again, stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H, where you'll find information and links on all of our guests by going to the weekly Stuff File page. Just look for the corresponding program number, and once again, that's 0791. Email me at peter@thestufffile.com. You can also find me on Facebook, Spoutable, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as PA Holder. Check us out on patreon.com, or you can become a patron of the program. Hope to see you back here for our next show on the air, online, or as a download. We're coming to you from everywhere, including KDXRadio.com, over the air on World FM in New Zealand, WLSLLP-FM in Dade City, Florida, KZZHLP-FM in Eureka, California, CKUW-FM in Winnipeg, CFMU in Hamilton, CKLU in Sudbury, Local 107.3 FM in St. John, CHSR in Fredericton, CFQR 600 in Montreal, and also streaming on just about any streaming service your little heart desires. That's it. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder, a presentation of Flying Fish Communications. We leave you with this scientific quandary. If, as Einstein said, space and time are the same, then can you be 5 miles late?